Change your perception of what you're looking at, and everything changes. Hey, my name is Giorgio Genaus, and this is the How to Do Life podcast. If you've ever felt that no matter what you try, something is missing, then you're in the right place. My aim with this podcast is to begin filling in those blanks for you. So open your mind and get ready, because I'm about to show you an entirely different way to look at your life. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So let's get started. Welcome back to another episode. I've been thinking about this quote that has stayed with me for a long time. When I read it, it must have been 15 years ago. It's by a brilliant man, Viktor Frankl, who was the creator of logotherapy. He was a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps in the Second World War and lived on to share his insights from the experience of being in a really challenging environment to then help people escape the internal prisons and encampments that they've created for themselves after the war. And there's this wonderful quote from his book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he says, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Now, this is a lovely quote to hear if it was to come from anyone, but it has extra weight and it's quite profound coming from someone who survived a concentration camp, which were, for most people, I would say at least 80% of the population in the Western world, is much worse than anything any of us would experience. Obviously, I haven't spoken to everyone that exists, so that's an arbitrary number. But we could probably agree that most of us in the modern world haven't endured anything that's remotely similar to that, at least in the Western world, in the developed countries. And so it's profound because we can all struggle with different levels of suffering and then look to our environment and say, well, it's all these different environmental factors external of me. It's the way the government is run. It's who's in leadership. It's the economic climate. It's the Reserve Bank. It's monetary policy. It's my employer. It's the culture at my workplace. It's the people outside of me. It's my friends who are really bitchy and gossipy, or it's my workplace colleagues where everyone's trying to play the corporate game and be strategic and use each other. It could be that it feels like the marketplace that I'm involved in is very competitive, whether it's the job marketplace or the entrepreneurial marketplace. All of these factors are looking at external factors. We're not looking at ourselves. We're looking at all these different sources outside of us, pointing the finger, saying that's the reason why. It's got nothing to do with what you can do for yourself, but it's all these external factors. So if there's anybody in recent history, in modern history, who would be justified in blaming their environment for their suffering, it would be people who navigated concentration camps, prisoners, who could look at their external circumstances of those situations and say, well, it's my environment and my suffering is because of this environment. And yet there was at least one man who was documented, and perhaps many more outside of him, who didn't write books and didn't necessarily publicly share their stories, who shared a similar view to him of holding on to the internal truth that it's the view we carry that helps us navigate no matter how difficult the challenges are. And the reason I want to give that to you is because I've seen this true for a lot of the traumas that I've helped people work through, including some of my own. It's rarely the circumstances themselves that's the issue. It's the way we're looking at them, which I know is kind of feels like a rich thing to say because I may not know you. And you may be listening to this thinking, he's got no idea what I've been through. And if you're someone I don't know, that's true. I don't know what you've been through. But with the experience that I've had over the years, helping a lot of people from a wide spectrum of different experiences and walks of life, with a wide spectrum of different traumas, what I have seen to be incredibly consistent is that it's a question of perception, and it's rarely a question of the experience itself. And this is why I keep coming back to this Viktor Frankl quote, because he's somebody who's experienced significantly more challenge and trauma as far as human suffering goes compared to me and compared to many people that I know. And yet he still found a way to extract a truth and various gifts throughout the experience to help him see his life and his experience in the concentration camp differently. And so I lean on his insight during deep pain so I can help those of you that are seeking it. And I encourage you to please read his book, Man's Search for Meaning. There are wonderful insights throughout his writings and what he experienced there. And so what I've found to be true is this other quote from Dr. David Hawkins, where he says, all the great masters point within. The masses, they'll point out. They'll point out to their environment. They'll point out to their external circumstances and say, this is why. Let's say it's an economic situation. The stock market's crashing. I've lost lots of money. The economy's crashing and I'm screwed. So they'll blame all these external factors. But then we will always find people in the same economic environment that you're in, that you may be blaming, and they're finding ways to make more money than they've ever made. We see businesses that have been created in all different kinds of economic hardships during the global financial crisis or the housing crisis or during COVID or whatever the circumstances may be, and they've flourished and they've done really well. So they find opportunities. And so if it's true, if the blanket statement is true that our environment is what creates the circumstances that we struggle under and that's the reason why, and there's no way to find a way through it, then that would be a universal truth for everybody that's exposed to the same environment. And so if we're looking at a broader macro environment that we're all a part of, then it would be true for all of us, but it's simply not. And so the question is, if there are people that are able to find a way through those circumstances, not buying into the collective belief that the environmental factors are the issue, then that suggests if we just change our perception and align it with the people who we may label as opportunists because they're looking for the opportunities, then suddenly we start to see opportunities ourselves. And we see these narrow paths through what appears to be really thick bush or forestry. And suddenly there's like this way through it. And then you get out the other side while everyone else is still sitting there with their arms crossed going, there's no way through this. Why would I bother? The environment's crap. So for you, what I want to encourage you to do is look at the external factors. Now, there's this really important aspect to all of this that I teach my clients and my students that transformed my experience years ago. And I call it developing psychological immunity. Now, the analogy I like to use here is physiological immunity, your immune system in your body. Now, this is pretty consistent for most people's experience. Maybe you're an outlier, this hasn't happened for you. But there are plenty of times in your life, if you're an adult now, where you've been exposed to a number of other people being sick with a cold or a flu or something like that, and you didn't get it. And then you've experienced other times where nobody's been sick, but you've managed to get sick. And those people hung around you and maybe they didn't get it. The difference between you and them is that there is a strong, fortified immune system that's also adaptable and functioning well. And so if everyone's exposed to the same virus, but everyone's having a different experience of it, that suggests that there may be something to do with our personal immune system that's affecting how severe our experience of what that is, or even if we get it at all. Now, I can point back to the global pandemic that we've all recently experienced. And there's a lot of evidence of that too. Taking a question of whether or not you got the medical assistance with it or not, if we just look at our individual experiences, there were plenty of households where the whole house would get it and one person wouldn't. And vice versa. One person would get it and the rest of the household wouldn't get it when there was a different strain. There's something to be said about the immune system's role in all of that. And so we've all experienced that, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and maybe even post. What's fascinating to me is that it no longer becomes an issue of the environment. It becomes an issue of what is happening internally that helps us develop an adaptability and a fortification against the environmental factors. So I take this same idea from your physiological immune system and I apply it to your psychology. We often look at our external environment and say, I want none of it. That needs to get away from me. We're in judgment. The environment is crap. The environment is no good for me. And that might be the environmental factors of people in your life. It might be the literal environment. It may be economic environment. It may be political environment. It may be the psychological environment of the people around you, the way they think and the belief structures that they have that you don't necessarily align with or agree with, or you find some conflict with. My preference for you is not to try and run away from all those environments. My preference is to actually help you develop psychological immunity so you can be exposed to it. And it's like water off a duck's back. It just rolls right off without actually wetting and absorbing into any of the feathers of the duck, which is hard to develop. And it's especially difficult to develop when you're in the environment. And I understand that. So giving yourself some space from really difficult environments can be valuable while you go and develop the strengthened immune system and the fortified immune system psychologically. But you don't want to completely avoid it because you will spend your life running. You can't escape challenge. You can't escape conflicting ideas and thoughts. You can't escape people that are going to challenge you and question you and criticize you. So the best thing you can do is develop a fortification, an adaptability, and a psychological immunity, because that will then empower you to not feel at the whim of environmental factors. Now, I say this with experience. I've been immersed in a lot of different environments throughout my life, just like a lot of people, family, professional environments, aspirational environments, careers, workshops, communities. And a mixture of them were both great and difficult and challenging. And I found that in some instances, because it was so difficult for me to separate my own way of thinking from the collective group that I was a part of, for example, my family, it required space between me and my family, physical space, to be able to go inward really deeply and get a clear understanding of what my beliefs were and what my views of the world were and how they were different from my family. And it wasn't I'm pushing them away, I don't want anything to do with them, but it just required creating some physical space. And so I'm not against taking a little hiatus, taking a little bit of a break to get out of the environment, but going inwards and fortifying that immune system, that psychological immune system, so then you can place yourself back in that environment and not feel so affected by it and not feel so triggered by it. That's a really important aspect, I believe. And the more you can do that in these different challenging environments, the further you'll get, because you won't expose yourself to something or people that challenge you a little bit and say, whoa, I want none of that, I'm getting away from it. You can just observe with curiosity. You can participate if it's helpful to participate, if it's a situation that you can't necessarily get out of very easily, and engage in it, but not necessarily succumb to their way of thinking. You can understand their view, you can understand their way of life, their belief system, but you don't have to be a part of it. You don't have to agree and consent to it. Because the reality is we only really let things into our mind if we give consent, if we give permission to allow somebody else's beliefs in. And we do that when we put people up on a pedestal or when we admire them, when we look up to them, And so we sort of download and take on what they believe as our own, and we let it in. You don't have to do that. You can observe with curiosity, and there may be things that are valuable. And this is the thing. In order for you to be able to extract value from these experiences and develop that fortified and strengthened immune system, it requires you stepping away and then asking yourself, how are these people's belief structures? How is their view? How is that environmental factor? How is that helping me? What's the gift? What's the lesson? What's the value that I can extract from this that will actually help me and has been helping me up until this point? For example, with family, I noticed that my family had a different belief structure about how life worked that I didn't necessarily agree with. And it wasn't bad, it wasn't negative or anything like that, but they were just different. It was, square peg, round hole. They didn't fit really well together. And so I struggled to reconcile that because they're my family and I wanted to agree with them. But at the same time, I found it really difficult to agree with them because I found in my experience, what they were believing wasn't necessarily a complete truth. And I was finding truths elsewhere in what I was studying and reading and the different people I was learning from. And so I had to let it go. But then in the process of letting it go, I also had to question, where's the value in their belief system? Where's the value in them thinking this way? How is that actually helping me? And I realized several of the factors were that it was grounding me, because it's easy to start to think that because you see things a certain way that makes you right or better, when in reality there's no right or wrong in that aspect. There's no better or worse. There's just different. And so when I realized that, it was actually quite grounding, and I realized it helped me stay humble without getting carried away and getting really arrogant about the way I saw the world, which is easy to do for any of us if we allow our egos to take the reins and take over. And the other thing I realized too was that it was kind of refreshing because it gave me deep insight into the way a lot of people think, which helped me understand that if I want to help people, I need to understand the way that they think. And my family was giving me a glimpse into how a lot of people think, which was informing my ability to then go and help people. So it felt like it was a little university, a little structure of a little curriculum that I had to go through to understand how to go and help people more effectively. And I was able to do that within my own home. So then when it came to actually helping people, and they were sharing different perceptions and beliefs and views of the world, I was like, I know how to deal with this. I've seen it before. This isn't my first time. When I'm talking back in the early days of my career where I hadn't helped many people, having leaned on the experience of seeing how my family did things, that actually informed my ability to help people. So I assure you, there's different factors of the environments that you're not liking that are actually helping you. They're giving you a gift, and different lessons and experiences for you to extract, different gold nuggets that will actually serve you for a really long time into your future. So when you start to see these experiences and these environmental factors as almost like classrooms, it gives you this desire to pay attention and have a level of openness and curiosity to what you have to learn. And when you're paying attention with that curiosity, you tend to be humble about it rather than arrogant, saying, I want none of this. This is crap. You can just get right out. Instead, you sort of pay attention, you absorb, you take different details in, and you're like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about it. I didn't realize that. Maybe there's an opportunity there. And then suddenly, you've got a completely different view to what you would have had if you were closed down. Coming back to your physiological immune system, the more we resist getting sick, and I know this was true for me when I was younger, I hated getting the cold or getting the flu. And the more I resisted it, the worse I felt. I didn't like the idea of taking days off from work with my day job. I resented that. I also didn't like that I wasn't well enough to watch TV. I wasn't well enough to move about. I had all these different judgments and frustrations with getting sick. But then when I learned the value of getting sick, because I sat down and did the work and I started to look at all the different benefits and upsides of getting sick, when I did, I saw that there were a lot of gifts in it. There was a lot of value. And the moment I saw that there was just as much value as there was pain or difficulty with getting sick, I stopped resisting it so much. So if I noticed myself getting sick, I went, okay, this is probably what my body needs right now. A little bit of an upgrade, updating to the latest software for this season so I can keep up with everybody else. It was also helping me take a few days off and slow down and change my pace and do some reflection and give myself a break. It was also helping me strengthen my immune system even more so. So coming out of it, I'd be less likely to get what I just had. And so when I started to see all these gifts, there was still the symptoms, although the symptoms calmed down a little bit, but there was no suffering that was happening on top of the symptoms, which made it all worse. And so if you can reduce your suffering when you're exposed to environmental factors that you may resist or not like, and you start to embrace them, you unlock a completely different experience of life and you become one of those opportunists, which typically sounds bad. But I think when people think of an opportunist, they think of someone who exploits opportunities. But an opportunist, by definition, is someone who just finds opportunities and leverages them and uses them when everybody else is not. So I'd love to help you become an opportunist in your life and take all the opportunities that are abundant around you that you're overlooking because you're distracted by how crappy the environmental factors feel. And so when you soften your gaze on these environmental factors that you might be judging and resisting, you start to see the opportunities. They're like these little shiny nuggets that are all there. They're all trying to get your attention. And when you soften your gaze, suddenly you see the little flicker of light bouncing off these shiny little nuggets. And you're like, whoa, has that been there the whole time? And you go and grab that one. And then when you go over there, you notice another one over here. Like, wow, there are all these different nuggets in my life that I didn't realize were there. So spend time extracting the gift, looking for the opportunity. Viktor Frankl, during his time in the concentration camps, was looking for the opportunity to understand how much psychology influences our ability to survive, our ability to adapt, our ability to navigate hardship, some of the most difficult hardship you can imagine for humanity to experience. And he found that it was incredibly informative and valuable, and he was able to take all of those learnings and then go and share them with a wider audience post-war. And it's what he dedicated his life to doing. And he's had a profound impact. This man has had a significant impact on my life and many people that I know too, and I've never met him. And it's because he was willing to not submit himself to the thinking that the environment is it and that I have no governance internally over how I feel and think about that. He chose not to agree with that way of thinking and he reaped benefits as a result. And I'd love the same for you. So I hope this is encouraging to help you take ownership of the internal landscape and not worry too much about the environmental factors, because while they may be challenging, there's always a way through it. There's an opportunity to find. If you can find a way through it, you will end up doing really cool things with your life. And I can't think of anything more that I'd love for you. So I hope this message arrives in your life at the right time. And please feel free to come back to it. Listen to it again and again and again. Let this sink in. This concept of no longer submitting ourselves to our environmental factors and blaming the external world and being one of the great masters that points within ourselves, it served me really well. So I hope it does for you too. Anyway, with that being said, thank you for being here. Thanks for listening. Thank you for watching. I'm Giorgio Genaus. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.